Hello, everybody. This is Rick Manning, President of Americans for Limited Government, and just wanted to touch base about the big speech by Joe Biden tonight, State of the Union. And you're going to be surprised, but the State of the Union is just fine. It's strong. That's what we're going to hear. Joe Biden is going to be hail himself as the great deficit cutter, the man who won't negotiate cutting the size of government and the debt ceiling. Wants to claim that the ending of things like COVID policies and spending that was directly related to COVID, and ending that spending, he's taking credit. Well, the budget deficit went down on my watch, even though it had nothing to do with him. In fact, he's going to claim about a $1.8 trillion drop in the deficit in his two years in office, and the deficit has dropped. The annual deficit has dropped by $1.8 trillion. That's not disputable. What is disputable is why. And about $1.6 trillion of that is directly related to, guess what? It's related to our COVID ending. And the rest is related to the fact our revenues have gone up from 2019 by $1.5 trillion. Our economy is generating in 2022 $1.5 trillion more than it did in 2019. This isn't because tax policies. This is because once everybody else has returned to work, and so they've returned to work, and yet they have some sensibilities about different things, and so the economy has ended up growing quite a bit. People have been, as they make more money, are put into higher tax brackets, and as a result, they're sending more money to the federal government. And that is and so what Joe Biden is saying on one hand is, I'm the beneficiary of a $1.5 trillion addition to our revenues, getting us to $4.9 trillion in 2022. But I still had a budget deficit of $1.2 trillion, $1.25 trillion, directly related to the $400 billion that he spent on student loans. They didn't have authorization. The Supreme Court's determining whether or not he had the power to basically arbitrarily just lower student loan debt. So the Supreme Court's going to make that determination. That was a $400 billion spend. If he hadn't done that, the budget deficit would have been down to about $850 billion. We're talking about seeming unending and unaccounted for money going to Ukraine, and that might be a national policy. It's a good national policy if Congress says, Congress has to authorize that. So at least he's not just doing it arbitrarily. But it is an expenditure that wasn't planned on. And we have another situation that Robert Romano and dailytorch.com here at Americans for Limited Government has been all over, and that is on Medicaid, which Congress doesn't even consider because they look at Medicaid as being a part of mandatory spending. So they don't even really look about what they can do about it because they don't want to be accused of cutting Medicaid. Well, there are over 10 million people who are on Medicaid now who are not eligible. They got on because of economic dislocation during COVID, and Congress passed something that prohibited states from throwing them off Medicaid when they no longer qualified. So there's about 10 to 15 million free riders on Medicaid who are taking Medicaid, taking the benefit, but they're not actually eligible for the benefit. And on March 1, due to legislation passed Congress, they are going to, the states are now going to be allowed to disengage these people from Medicaid. And so that will be a process that the states will do. It's their place. But it should have a dramatic impact on the Medicaid spending simply by lowering the number of recipients. Currently, there's about 90 million recipients of Medicaid. If you took the 10 to 15 million, say 15 million off, that actually cuts your Medicaid spending by about a sixth. And you drop Medicaid spending by a sixth, that's going to take a huge hunk on the budget deficit. There's a couple of things that can be done. They're just easy peasy, and Biden really has uh, and should be actually non-negotiable. But I suspect he won't talk about ways to further lower the deficit. He's going to talk about claim the victory of him lowering the deficit. And the bottom line is, if he had actually passed the budgets that the Republicans in the House and the Republicans in the Senate were proposing, if he'd passed that and been amenable to talking about real compromise in terms of cuts, he could actually take some credit on it. But the fact of the matter is, he hasn't. And with the debt ceiling debate, which I'm sure he'll be very strident about, talking about how that it'll be calamitous for the country if we don't pass a debt ceiling increase, seems to me that he forgets his constitutional role. His constitutional role is he didn't have one. He can sign a bill, but it's the House of Representatives that has to present that bill. And so hopefully what will happen is Speaker McCarthy will pass a debt ceiling increase bill that puts real guardrails and cuts the budget, or at least stems the growth of the budget, and zero growths it for a few years. If that happens, then the Senate can figure it out, and the Senate can then fight it out with the House in terms of what they're willing to send to the president, and ultimately the president can decide if he wants to sign it or not. But he doesn't get to write it. He doesn't get to dictate terms. He gets to say, here's what I will sign, here's what I won't sign. But the fact is, if he thinks of raising the debt ceiling so important, then he'll need to sign whatever they send to him. And that will be a decision he gets to make. Other things he'll talk about, he continually, astonishingly, claims, at least his press secretary, continually claims that the gas prices are lower today than they were when he took office, which is just factually untrue. Gas prices were down around $2.60 a gallon when he took office, and for those of us who are paying attention, it's about, at least I just say today I paid about $3.60 a gallon, so it's about $1 more where I got my gas. So you look at it and you say, okay, well, that's not true. He'll talk about restoring the manufacturing sector. And the challenge with that is, a lot of manufacturers shut down when the government shutdown occurred due to COVID. And because of the state policies that wouldn't allow them to open, many of them remained shut down through the remainder of the Trump administration. And then magically, when Biden became president, all those liberal states, the Californias, the New Yorks, and the like, all suddenly opened their economies up. And so you had some of those manufacturing jobs rebound. The truth is, there's about 200,000 more manufacturing jobs in America now than there was in 2019. And so before the COVID shutdowns. So if he wants to take credit for an increase of 200,000 manufacturing jobs in the country out of about 5.5 million, he can do so. But the fact is, what he wants to do is he always wants to start from the point that where he doesn't want to start from when the economy got COVID, got the Chinese flu, and it had a negative impact on the entire economy. He doesn't want to start from 2019, which is the real benchmark, or at least February 2020, which is the real benchmark. He wants to start when the recovery was about 65 to 70% through. And so it increases his numbers, and it really makes Trump's numbers look terrible. But bottom line is, because it destroyed all the job gains that President Trump had over 3 years. Biden also is really good right now at talking about how people are making more money, and he doesn't actually understand that the cost, there's something called real wages, and real wages, the people are losing, their money is worth less now and buys less than it did. And the raises that they might have gotten have not kept up with inflation. And so we see that real wages are actually lower. It's part of the reason why people are discontented. And it's because the syndrome is simple. And I saw it in the 70s with my mom when I was growing up. And she used to say, the harder I work, the farther I fall behind. And that's exactly true. So that's what we're seeing now. I want to take some comments here because it's people are jumping in with all sorts of good comments. So let's see what we have. First one in. Oh, there we go. I kind of obviously I'm not. I was attracted by the Kansas City Chiefs sign, and Jeannie Trevino. I will tell you this: I am. I don't fall. I'm not neither a Philadelphia Eagle fan nor a Kansas City Chief fan, but the I really don't like the Philly fans. They're pretty obnoxious, and so if I have to go for somebody, I'm going to go for the Chiefs. Although I really like, I think Jalen Hurts is really a uh, seems like a really good guy, and so no matter who wins, uh, I think everybody will make a lot of money, and you and I will be the ones giving them money by continuing to put eyeballs on the tube and allowing the NFL to charge exorbitant rates for their television shows. Let's see here. It seems like a theme. We've got a theme. It's and there's a theme. Wow, this is great stuff. Uh, yeah, Catherine, this is a great point because uh, there's a couple of reasons why our spending is so high. One I talked about was the continuing claims, so people have been remaining on Medicaid even though they weren't qualified, and with a massive impact on our budget with how much we spend. The other is, and we're really have a hard time getting our arms around the truth on this, and so I won't quote figures, but we do know that with 5 million illegal aliens coming across the border in the last 2 years, we have a problem because there's a taxing of our social service networks that is overburdening them, makes it so they aren't responsive to people who are eligible, who are and genuinely need them, because they're busy chasing around after a bunch of people who are in the system who shouldn't be there. And it's so making it so people who come to this country illegally are not beneficiaries of our system is kind of fundamental. In fact, to be a legal immigrant, you have to be able to show you have a job for a reason, because the policy, our immigration policy, is if you don't have a job, we're not going to let you come here legally because we don't want to support you. And when you have a policy like the Biden administration, where basically you let everybody in and then they go to sanctuary states that are going to basically allow them to get all the social services, and suddenly the federal government's paying a huge amount of money on those social services. That's the real cost of our failed immigration policy. It's not just the evils of the drugs being transported and the horrific impact that has on our communities. Is the 120,000 people who died of opioid poisoning last year. Those are all real impacts. The violence on the streets as drug cartels are fighting for control of our streets and for the distribution networks for their drugs. The fact that we don't have a border for all intents and purposes, and we find a lot of kidnappings occurring, and with easy transit of people who are kidnapped in America being shipped elsewhere, and and the United States becoming the largest country for human trafficking in the world. Think about that. We're the largest country for human trafficking in the world because the coyotes who bring the illegal immigrants over are human trafficking. Those people get passed around many times as just basically chattel, and are used for all sorts of things that are just terrible. And that's human trafficking. Biden can't run from the border crisis he's created. And as he talks about the budget deficit, imagine a budget deficit that didn't have to absorb the equivalent of the city of Los Angeles every year and a half, because that's what he's done. Is he's allowing the equivalent of the second largest city in America to come into our country illegally every year and a half. That doesn't count the 1 million legal immigrants who come into our country. So this is so when he talks about budget deficit, imagine there's some things that can be done that can immediately impact how much we spend, without having much of an impact on the cost, on the human cost to Americans and people here legally and citizens. Let's see here. Florida girl. Good afternoon, Rick. I will not be giving the with the POTUS clown State of the Union blip in my valuable life this evening. I will have her vote to I impeach the POTUS. Well, unfortunately for me, I have to. So I have a bunch of radio interviews tomorrow that I've got to do about it. So I don't get to. So we'll probably do a quick live stream. We're going to have a live stream, or at least a video tomorrow morning that gets put up. That'll have about 5 minutes commentary on it. Robert Romano will also be writing a piece, likely a piece about what he talks about the debt ceiling, since that's really the definitive debate about the fiscal future of our country. So we'll have a few things on that, and if there's a need, I'll go in and I'll do a dissection of it tomorrow as well. Let's see here. The old adage, okay, the rich get richer, the hardworking Americans get poorer. That's sadly very true, Catherine. My wife and I often say, anytime we hear that there's a tax cut, tax credit, any of that kind of stuff, we always know, well, we know we're not going to get it, A, and B, we know that somehow we're going to end up paying for it. So it's the way a lot of people feel as they hear about these government programs and all the people who want to come from DC and say, I'm from Washington, I'm here to help. Trust me, they are not. They're here. They're there in many cases to line their own pockets. I have to say, I think when America saw the China balloon going across the country, and our country and our military and our president's failure to even respond in a meaningful way, waiting for it to collect all the data that they wanted to collect, and then shooting it down. And since they could track it, they shot it down in a place where they didn't even have salvage vehicles, salvage ships readily available. Then start the salvage ships flowing towards the South Carolina coast, because there are salvage ships on the East Coast. So they didn't do that. So you didn't have salvage ships even on the scene to engage in immediate salvage of what fell. And sometimes when the gang can't shoot straight, the reason is because they don't want to hit the target. And I'll leave it at that. Well, Catherine, I'm sorry, but you're dreaming there. You're dreaming. That ain't happening. It's let's see what else we got. Tim, we saw the Klaus Schwab, the World Economic Forum, stand up and say that they want the world to follow the China model of a communist country with no freedoms, with minorities being not just abused but enslaved, and having their body parts ripped from them against their will to sell to the wealthy. Klaus Schwab thinks that China is the model that should be followed, and yet the Biden administration politicians still went to Davos to play around with the World Economic Forum. It's my hope that anybody who gets reelected, anybody who gets elected in 2025, that one of the things they'll do is disconnect themselves from the World Economic Forum. Judy, you're right. It's a problem. And, one thing that I think Senator Tom Cotton has legislation that would take away the preferred trade status that China was given during the Clinton administration in 1998. And there was a stream that if China was economically intertwined with the West, they would become more tolerant and more of an egalitarian. Egalitarian is wrong. More of a look more like the West. Let's put it that way. And unfortunately, 24 years later, 23 years later, the truth is that passage of this PNTR, permanent normalized trade relations, has made us look a lot more like China, rather than having China look a lot more like us. And so we had assumed that by being involved with us economically, our superior value system would transform them. And unfortunately, what's happened is our value system has been degraded over time to such an extent that the idea of socialism is fine with a lot of people under the age of 30. And that's just astonishing. So, yeah, we need to get rid of the kind of the root of the tree is normalized trade relations with China. And we need to make them pay a bigger tariff to import goods from China. And what will happen if they have to pay a bigger tariff is you want to get the supply chain out of China, make it too expensive to build things in China and ship it to the biggest consumer in the world. That's how you do it. And that's what Tom Cotton has introduced. And we're going to be pushing that really hard. Yeah, Catherine, once again, I wish, I don't think that, let me just, there's something I'm going to talk about the balloon for a second. It's that we've got a really weird situation with this balloon because we've been told like 3 different stories. Okay. First story that came out was they were tracking the balloon and a decision was made not to shoot it down by the White House, okay, by the Oval Office, not to shoot it down. The military was prepared to shoot it down. Oval Office didn't want to do so. After the balloon got shot down, after it traversed the entire country, the story was the White House wanted to shoot down the balloon all along, and it was the military that wouldn't do it. Well, if the military wasn't willing to shoot down the balloon and the commander-in-chief ordered them to shoot down the balloon, then there's a whole bunch of people need to be court-martialed. So that's 2. Actually, there's 4 things. 3, it's unclear what the intelligence agencies were actually saying, whether they actually saw the balloon initially. Were they tracking it from, through around South Korea and up to Japan and up to Alaska and then down to Montana? Were they tracking it before a cattleman looked up in the sky and saw a second moon that looked suspiciously like the Death Star and said, what the heck's going on here? Until that occurred, no, were they tracking it? That's something we need to know if this was an intelligence failure, which would explain why it wasn't shot down before it got to the United States, or if this was a failure of leadership by Biden and they made a decision not to shoot it down, or if our military refused to shoot it down, at which point Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Milley needs to be given his packing papers, and he'd be lucky if he isn't court-martialed out if they refuse a direct order from the president. So those are and then lastly, we have these weird reports out of the Pentagon, once again, which gives you credence to the idea that they wouldn't shoot down the balloon. And we got weird reports out of the Pentagon that there were 2 balloons that flew over, one over Texas and one over Florida, that hadn't been tracked or that President Trump wasn't told about, and the White House wasn't told about because they were afraid that he would create World War III. Now, if that's true, okay, and the source of that is it's unnamed sources, but people I know believe that the source of it is the same guy who runs a kind of a covert section of the Pentagon, who was behind the attempt by a guy named Stephen Halper to flip, to try to get get some people to show there was a tie between President Trump or candidate Trump and the Russians at the very beginning of the Russia collusion scandal. So a guy who was tied into the Russian collusion scandal is a lot of reports are coming out that he was the source of the two balloons during the Trump administration story. And now the Pentagon is saying, well, the White House wasn't informed of it, which, once again, ask yourself, if we have spy balloons flying over our country, invading our territory, invading our sovereign territory, and the Pentagon's deciding, oh, we don't need to bother the president because I'm afraid he'll do something like ask us to shoot him down or tell us to shoot him down. Isn't that that's not their decision to make. None of those guys were elected. So we've got, so a lot of these stories coming out, if anybody's able to poke holes in them and find out who's behind it, the bottom line is somebody's got to be held accountable. And the person who ultimately is accountable, it'd just be interesting to see if Joe Biden's shoot down order was neglected or denied, A, and B, did they hide from President Trump and the White House Chinese spy balloons? Because remember, it was Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Milley, who reported proudly that after the election and before the inauguration of Joe Biden, that he had contacted his counterpart in China to assure him that he would make certain that there were no erratic actions from the United States, essentially putting himself in the position of being the decider as to what the interests of the United States were. Rather than the person who's duly elected president of the United States. So there's an arrogance at the Pentagon, which is disturbing. And, you hear all the time in these different countries about coups by the military officials. Well, a soft coup is one where a president issues an order and the order isn't followed. An even softer coup is there's a threat to the country and the military decides they're not going to inform the president because they decide that they know better about what to do and how to handle it. Those are massive problems. They go to the heart of whether we are a representative democracy or are we basically just controlled pawns based on the intel communities and the Pentagon deciding what our elected officials are supposed to know and what they're not supposed to know, and putting themselves in the place of being the true leaders of our country. I don't remember voting for General Milley. I don't know about you. Florida girl. Saw my gas fees from over 2 years ago. Thank goodness that I do. Yeah, that's it's always nice to be able to show somebody and remind them of what it was and where we were. Let's see here. Alan, listen, it doesn't take a genius to see when you have Susan Rice running domestic policy and his foreign policy team are former Obama officials. It doesn't take a genius to see that this is effectively the third Obama term. And in fact, the fact is that a lot of the things that are occurring in terms of spying on America were put in place in 2011 and come out of the State Department. So there's a division set up in the State Department that did that. So now, truthfully, the spying out of the Department of Homeland Security, while it might have happened before this, in 2018, the Republicans and Democrats came together and passed a bill that there's a small section of it which actually permits communication between the Department of Homeland Security and social media companies in order to prevent misinformation, malinformation, and disinformation. And that authorization by Congress has been put on steroids under the Biden administration, although they were doing it in 2020. It's put on steroids. It's a problem, and we have people clapping and cheering when the disinformation board gets cut down. But the fact is, the mechanism for the disinformation board is still there, and they're still doing it. And we know they've been doing it for at least 4 years now, and both sides of the aisle are culpable on it. So one of the things we're determined to do is to try to make it so this communications, dealing with everything from COVID to elections to any number of other things, that it get crushed. I'm going to just end with one other thing today. The House passed yesterday legislation which ends a lot of the COVID-related vaccination requirements that have been put into place by Biden. And so that is so that's good news. We'll see what happens in the Senate. And from there, we'll move ahead. But that's that's where we'll be. There's lots of good things that are happening, and lots of bad things are happening. But I couldn't let the Biden State of the Union address go by without commenting on it a little bit. And we'll be putting out more copy tomorrow and maybe a little bit tonight on the address as it comes up. The one thing that all you people are saying you're not going to watch, it's worth doing, is after the address, Sarah Huckabee Sanders will be giving the rebuttal, and I think that'll be worth watching. So I would strongly encourage you to try to time it so you can see Sarah Huckabee Sanders, but not be subjected to Joe Biden, because I think her response will be extraordinary. It's going to be on point, and I think it's worthwhile to watch. With that, I am going to bid you a fond farewell, and we will likely talk to you tomorrow.